Today we're looking at Unit 8, Notes number 4, Expanding the Movement. So types of segregation. So de jure segregation was segregation by law, and the civil rights movement targeted this type of segregation the most. So we're talking, bus boycotts, segregation within schools. That's where we see court cases coming about trying to change the laws and allow for integration. But there's another type of segregation, de facto segregation. And this is segregation that exists through custom and practice rather than by law. And it's more difficult to overcome. So if you look at big cities, oftentimes you may notice that certain areas of cities get populated more by specific ethnic groups. And this just happens where there might be a Korean part of town, a black part of town, a Hispanic part of town, and just as people move to the cities, they find these little niches where these neighborhoods have grocery stores that sell their type of food, churches, whether they're Catholic or Presbyterian, or if they're Jewish and they have a synagogue. And so within cities, you just have these communities, develop organically. People choose to live there because they want to be surrounded with people that speak their language, make the same type of food, that they feel comfortable with, that they share traditions with, not because people force them to. And so you end up having schools then that are primarily maybe, Italian, German, Chinese, and again, not by law. So overcoming that type of segregation is more difficult. In some cases, this is somewhat forced when you have real estate agents that won't show minorities into maybe homes in nicer areas, even if they can afford them, white-only neighborhoods, and so in that case, that is kind of a, what do I want to say, call it like a barrier that they have to overcome. So factions within the movement. The civil rights movement was seen as a unified effort, but in fact it was made up of diverse groups. By the mid-1960s, conflicts among these groups began to develop. People within the civil rights movement began to feel that changes in the law did not alter attitudes. They began to question whether nonviolent protest methods were working, and more extreme groups began to develop. So Stokely Carmichael. In May of 1966, Stokely Carmichael became the new head of SNCC. SNCC was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so it was primarily comprised of college-age students that would go out and organize protest movements, boycotts, targeting lunch counters, places that had segregation. And in their early years, they were very much kind of following in the steps of Martin Luther King Jr., and nonviolent. But as the movement's progressing and not as much progress is being made, he began to seek alternative means for political empowerment of African Americans. He supported aggressive action and called for Black power. So kind of becoming, again, a little bit more aggressive, not just like we're going to follow, toe the line like we have been, like we want to kind of take it a step further. So he was, even though it's kind of called Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he's being a little bit more aggressive, not to the point of, we're organizing attacks on people or individuals, but just not these quiet protest movements like they had been in the past. So Black Panthers. Black Power appealed to many young African Americans and inspired the founding of the group, the Black Panther Party, in October of 1966. The Black Panthers rejected nonviolence and called for a violent revolution as a means of African American liberation. To achieve their goals, the Panthers carried guns and monitored African American neighborhoods to guard against police brutality. So again, often symbols of violence, but more so the Black Panthers wanted to keep their community safe, and so they felt if they were being attacked, then they would arm themselves against attacks from the police, and so sometimes that meant carrying weapons, carrying guns. So would they purposely go and shoot people? No, but they wanted to protect themselves, their communities. They didn't just stand for the, well, if I'm getting beat, I'm just going to stand there and take it. No, we're going to fight back. And so that's very, some people saw that as being very controversial, versus just being able to stand up for yourself. And so the Black Panthers sometimes get stereotyped into this, people that stood for violence. So a turning point. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 was passed by Congress and ended discrimination in housing. After school segregation ended, the number of African Americans who finished high school and who went to college increased significantly. This led to better jobs and business opportunities. By 1970, an estimated 2/3 of eligible African Americans were registered to vote. So there is progress with all this change. It probably isn't happening, or I know it isn't happening as fast as people would like it to happen. But with school segregation ending, you see more African Americans going to college, having higher paying jobs, getting out of poverty, and that is the goal. People just wanted it to happen a lot faster. So the women's movement. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, the movement for women's rights was known by several different names. Women's liberation, the equal rights movement, the feminist movement. The idea of feminism is that women and men should be socially, politically, and economically equal. And so when we talk about the civil rights movement, it does include, it's not just about African Americans, but it also includes the women's movement. In the notes, I don't talk about Cesar Chavez, but there was a whole movement for Hispanic Americans, farmers' rights. So it's just kind of all of these minority groups at this time coming together, speaking out, and ultimately wanting to be treated equally. They just want the same opportunities as everybody else. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 also included and banned gender discrimination. So, effects of the movement. In 1973, the Supreme Court decided in the case of Roe v. Wade. State laws that banned abortion were struck down. The court ruled that such laws violated a constitutional right to privacy. And so this issue over abortion is still very, very controversial today. People, who are pro-life are very firm that they're pro-life. People are pro-choice, again, very firm. Those in support felt that legal abortion was necessary to protect women's health, that it's a woman's body, it's her choice, the pro-choice side. Those opposed felt that fetal life is sacred and should be protected, and feel that they're speaking for the unborn, the pro-life portion of it. And so depending on what side you're on, again, people's right to choose. So currently, Roe v. Wade is still the decision. There is talks of, could this come to the Supreme Court again? Would the decision change? We've seen the Supreme Court make other changes, just like with Plessy versus Ferguson and then Brown, where we didn't want segregation and then we did. So it definitely is something that could change. Will it change? Will it go to the Supreme Court? That is still uncertain. So leaders of Womens Lib. Betty Friedan became a pioneer in the women's movement with her best-selling book, The Feminine Mystique. Her book sparked debates about the roles and rights of women. So Betty Friedan was a housewife in the 1950s. She had also went to college. And so being a housewife, stay-at-home mom, didn't necessarily feel that that was fulfilling enough for her, and saw that as a society, women were kind of pushed into those roles. And it created a lot of depression for women because they weren't able to truly maximize what they wanted to be. So she called for reforms to aid women and families, flexible work schedules, equal pay, equal opportunities. And so she's one of many women that kind of spoke out at the time. So this is the end of the notes. You want to make sure you go back through your key terms, fill in anything you may have missed. If you haven't watched the notes for 8.3, you go back and watch those notes as well.